Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon. My name is Matthew Goodman. I'm Senior Vice President and I run the economics program at CSIS in Washington. And I'm delighted to welcome you here today for the launch of another book by the CSIS economics program's own John Hillman. And I'm going to hand over in a minute to Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian and John to talk about the book. But before I do that, let me just say a word about John and about the book. In his day job, John runs our really innovative and world-acclaimed Reconnecting Asia project, where we track, map, and analyze infrastructure developments around the world. Despite the name Asia, it's a global platform, and obviously looked a lot at China's Belt and Road and other infrastructure developments. John has been running that, doing a lot of events and writings, and meanwhile has been writing now 2 books during his time with us in that role. And the second book, which is called The Digital Silk Road, and the subtitle is China's Quest to Wire the World and Win the Future, has just come out. It's a terrific book again, and it really deals with a very important set of issues, which is China's efforts to extend its earlier efforts in infrastructure, harder things like roads and ports, which they're continuing to do, but on a slightly reduced scale, and laying down digital infrastructure. This is something, telecom networks, subsea cables, satellites, smart or safe cities, as they call them. And John documents all of that. And then he really gives a kind of wake-up call to the United States and its partners, saying that, while China's been doing this, we've been sort of still assuming that we are the dominant hub in these networks of digital connectivity. And so he really is advising us to kind of wake up and get back in the game, and says, happily, that there is still time for us to get back in the game, and to offer alternatives that really appeal to users around the world, particularly in the emerging world. So it's a terrific book. And once again, like his first book, The Emperor's New Road, John uses a great combination of facts, analysis, and storytelling. He was a little constrained this time because he couldn't travel around the world, but he still managed to make it to Glasgow, Montana, and tells a great story there. And also he signed up for 2 professional certification programs offered by the Chinese surveillance company Hikvision, which is sort of a sign of how innovative and creative he is when he goes about this book writing. Anyway, it's a terrific book. I highly commend it to you. And I will now hand it over to Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian, who is China reporter for Axios, and I think very well known to this audience. So over to you, Bethany.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Matt. I'm so excited to talk today with John about his new book. And when I heard he was coming out with a new book on this topic, I was thrilled because I read John's book last year and did a similar event for his book, The Emperor's New Road. And for me, and I've been reading about the Belt and Road Initiative since it was first conceived, years, almost a decade ago. But John's, in that book, I felt that his analysis and his on-the-ground reporting from 16 different countries and his presentation of the Belt and Road as not a revival of ancient trade routes, but rather an imperial infrastructure building project was not only like a good framework, but like a predictive framework for understanding how the Chinese Communist Party acts, how the Chinese government acts, and what they're going to do in the future. And that was really helpful for me. So with that in mind, I was so excited to see this book, The Digital Silk Road, and see John once again, use his magic pen to address this topic, which I think is also sort of on the edge of our knowledge here in the US. We're just sort of beginning to understand the structural concerns here, the structural concerns at play about China's growing dominance in communications technology. So with that, I would like to start a Q&A with John and remind our audience that we welcome your questions as you're viewing this live stream. Please, if you would like to ask a question, you can submit it right there, right below the live stream on the button that says Ask Live Questions Here, and I will be fielding those questions a little bit later in our conversation. So John, let's just start with the most basic question. What is the Digital Silk Road?
Yeah, basic and yet somewhat complicated. I think about it, to really oversimplify it, as basically the technology dimension of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which many people in this audience will be familiar with. But if you're not, the Belt and Road Initiative is Xi Jinping's signature foreign policy vision. It was announced in 2013, initially in this overland belt component and maritime road, somewhat confusingly. In the most active parts of that set of activities, it's not just infrastructure, but infrastructure has been a very big part of it. And the most active part of that infrastructure activity in the early days was really energy and transport. That's where most of the money was going. And so that's what I had started studying. But this digital dimension has been there all along. Sometimes it's not as apparent. So it's incorporated into things like ports. Sometimes it's easier to lay fiber optic cables when new roads and rail projects are being built. And then there's a whole nother set of technologies, things like safe cities or smart cities, that have been exported from China to particularly developing countries, many of whom are participants in the Belt and Road Initiative. So it at the end of the day, it really is the technology dimension of the Belt and Road.
And I feel like with the Digital Silk Road, it's not necessarily super well branded from the Chinese government side, and you hint at this where it's not always like a label that's stuck on something, but it's a bit sort of incorporated into the Belt and Road. Would you say that that's why there has been maybe less study into it, or less awareness of it in the West?
Yeah, I think that that's right. There's no official project criteria for what makes something a Digital Silk Road project. And this has been something that's been kind of grafted onto the Belt and Road after it was announced. So the first reference to it comes in 2015, but it's become a much more prominent dimension of the Belt and Road, particularly as China has pulled back some of its foreign lending, and especially in the wake of the pandemic, because this is a set of activities that is in really high demand. I mean, I think the pandemic has really driven home that you don't want to be on the losing side of the digital divide. And this, from China's perspective, this set of activities provides several incentives. One of them is that many of its companies are facing more scrutiny in advanced economies. And so to continue to grow, they're doubling down in emerging markets. These projects are also often easier to deliver in terms of the speed and a little bit less disruptive to their local environments, sometimes less expensive upfront compared to large transport and energy projects. So for all of those reasons, we're seeing an intensification of this set of activities that I think really does warrant more attention.
And what are some of those specific projects? I know that Matt mentioned your trip to Glasgow, Montana, or Glasgow, Utah? I get those confused.
Montana, yeah.
Montana, okay. Also, Africa's megacities are mentioned in your book. What are some of these specific projects?
Yeah, well, I think, what's somewhat interesting about this, and, maybe to be a little provocative, the United States has obviously not signed up to China's Belt and Road Initiative, but China's successful export of communications technology, its company's ability to really provide very upfront, low-cost tech has really caught on not only in the developing world, but parts of the developed world. And so, that's something that I saw in Glasgow, Montana, which is one of the most remote towns in the United States with over 1,000 people. The main provider there the main telecom provider there ended up going with Huawei, in 2010, 2011, just for the cost savings of it. And so you saw that sort of almost universal appeal before some of the awareness about some of the security risks was a little bit more widely appreciated. So that's how Glasgow, Montana gets into the story. But I found, in talking to people there, that they as someone put it to me somewhat colorfully, for many of their neighbors, China isn't something that they were talking about every day. It's sort of something that goes on your table for Thanksgiving, and they are now more aware of some of these risks. But I think at the end of the day, it just really drove home how affordability is such a driving factor for deciding who goes with what provider. And that's true whether you're in rural Montana or if you're in Kenya or Indonesia or somewhere else.
You mentioned in your book that around half of the world's population still doesn't have internet. So if China is planning to help provide internet and provide that infrastructure to half of the globe, why are we concerned about it? Well, why isn't that just a good thing?
So there is this digital divide that needs to be closed. And, again, I think the pandemic has underscored the fact that we're so reliant on these systems, and not, as much of the, developed world moved online to cope with the pandemic, whether it's for work or, entertainment or ordering your groceries, that option was not available to half of humanity. And so this is a really, first and foremost, a development imperative globally. But I think what's concerning is, you don't want to see a country become overly reliant on a single supplier for these systems, just given how important they are to the everyday functioning of society now. And we also now have, there's more than a few examples where there are red flags of these projects not going well. And I talk about them in the book. One example is a data center in Papua New Guinea that was, built with a loan from China Exim Bank, and basically doesn't operate. It had poor security standards. They didn't budget enough for operations and maintenance. There's a subsea cable that goes from Cameroon to Brazil that, again, was done with Chinese financing that sees very low levels of activity. And so, unfortunately, that's money that was spent in something that was not productive. There are examples in Pakistan where these safe city systems with surveillance cameras are malfunctioning or they're being provided with hidden hardware in some cases. So we see these examples, and to me, it's enough of a warning. It's not just a hypothetical anymore.
Mm-hmm. And in addition to, you mentioned the project's not going well, some of the equipment being faulty, and some other concerns. There's also, I think, privacy concerns and security concerns. Tell us about those.
Yeah, so depending on the systems you're talking about, there's a massive amount of information being moved around. And something that we've been tracking with the Reconnecting Asia project at CSIS is the fact that even while many advanced economies have been pushing Huawei away from their 5G networks, foreign governments, and much of the developing world are still welcoming Huawei into providing their cloud services and e-government services. And so it's that covers things like health records, even in some cases electronic voting, communications between government officials. And so this is really, those are core government functions with obviously a lot of sensitive data. And then you could talk about systems too, like subsea cables, which carry 95% of the world's international data. China now has the world's fourth provider of those systems. And so I think there's definitely, there's a commercial angle because the world needs more of them, but there's also these broader considerations.
I think Huawei is one of the best examples and most well-known examples of a lot of the issues around China's telecommunications infrastructure and why there are concerns about it. I mean, there's concerns about who is actually in control of Huawei or who can actually dictate it, about the kinds of data it might access. And I'm aware of, for example, some recent laws that have been passed in China, the cybersecurity law, national intelligence law, that, at least on paper, require entities and companies to hand over data to China's security services upon request, and even to keep that assistance a secret. But Huawei has denied that it would ever compromise, any data that would pass through, for example, its 5G systems. What do you think about that kind of disconnect between what we see as a legal environment and a security environment in China and Huawei's public statements?
Yeah, so I in the book spend a decent amount of time sort of recounting how Huawei became this, the world's leading supplier of telecommunications equipment. I think sometimes in Washington, it feels like it happened overnight. We woke up and all of a sudden Huawei was a leader in 5G, but obviously there's a longer story there. And part of that story, there are very close ties between the company and the Chinese government that seemed to be pretty important in its early days and facilitating its success, not only in raising barriers to foreign companies and competitors in China, but also facilitating deals outside of China, providing financial assistance. The Wall Street Journal did an investigation that estimated Huawei received about $75 billion in state support over the years. So there is, we are aware of this being, a symbiotic relationship where this company is really a national champion. The government has a stake in trying to ensure it survives, but that also comes, I think, with obligations. And you mentioned the legal environment too, which I think is a very important consideration.
And that brings me to a question that I have wanted to ask you. You mention in your book that people in DC and in Silicon Valley have tended to blame China's basically cheating behavior, its rule breaking. So in Huawei's case, hidden subsidies that allow it to undersell the global market. They blame that for China's success, for Huawei's success, for basically this upward trajectory of China's growing dominance in global telecommunications and communications technology. But what is that missing out? If we just blame, basically China cheated, there was nothing we could do. What's the bigger picture? What else has brought us to this place?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I think it's really important that we learn from our experience, and so that we're not repeating mistakes that we've made in the past. And so I think the version of that story that I think you nicely encapsulated, that version somewhat overlooks the way in which Huawei succeeded also by going to overlooked markets, right? So also going to places in the early days like Russia, when no one wanted to be there after a financial crisis, to Kenya, to Mexico, to Iraq and Afghanistan, and then eventually to rural Montana, in places again where larger U.S. companies were content to focus more on larger, richer markets. And so there is that element of the story. And I think in order to really compete in this set of activities, I think the lesson there is we do need to care about those smaller markets, and we especially need to care about the developing world.
I mean, that's a theme that we've seen in China's foreign policy for a long time. And that's central to the Belt and Road, the idea that these overlooked markets, that these overlooked countries, non-Western countries matter, and that, China presents itself as representing an alternative, right, to the Western-led order, which, tends to overlook those countries, to not view them as equal or not view them as important. And so what I hear you saying is that this is just another example of that, where China is taking seriously non-Western countries and trying to provide meaningful leadership of those countries. What are some of the specific actions that the US and the EU and European countries can take regarding China's outreach to the other side of the digital divide?
Yeah, so at the end of the day, I think it really does come down to providing affordable alternatives. The 5G competition has received a lot of attention. There's still more to do there, and I think there are ways in which the U.S. and its partners and allies can make more alternatives available through things like Open RAN architecture. But in other areas, the U.S. and its partners and allies actually have already off-the-shelf good products to offer. Huge leading provider of cloud services. When I look at a foreign government choosing Huawei to provide its cloud services, I sort of, I wonder about that, because third-party tests show that there are other, often more advanced services that are available. Some of those are provided by U.S. companies, and so that's an area in which the U.S. already has something to offer. I talk about in the book also this emerging area where I think there will be more competition in the future, which is to provide basically internet from outer space. And there are some innovative U.S. companies in that area that are ahead of the competition. And so some of this comes down to just trying to think of incentives to make those offerings more affordable and accessible in some of these lower income markets. Some of it also comes down to trying to improve the foreign regulatory environment, so that companies have a fair shot at competing. And I'm also, I'm heartened to see that this is a set of issues now receiving more attention in things like the Build Back Better World partnership that the G7 launched, in things like the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, in things like the Quad, which has a technology working group and an infrastructure coordination group. So it's encouraging to see this receiving more attention, and I think there's a lot of work to do.
I'll just take a moment to remind people who are watching that you can submit your questions via the live stream page for the button Ask Live Questions here. So be sure to submit those, and I will get to those in a few minutes. Let's talk about some of the other forms of telecommunications and other technology that Chinese companies have been providing around the world. Surveillance cameras and surveillance technology through safe cities. You mentioned Hikvision. There's fiber optic cables. Go through a couple of those specific. You mentioned satellites. Go through a few more so we have a broader picture of the whole scope of activities here.
Sure. So, just starting in the wireless space, I think sometimes based on what we hear and read, it might give you the impression that the entire world right now is trying to choose a 5G provider. That race is really still just getting started. Maybe only 15% of the world is going to be using 5G by 2025, and so there's still this massive demand for 4G services in much of the developing world. So that's one important set of activities. I've got a chapter on internet-connected devices and smart cities in the book. I think this is an area where there is no definition for exactly what a smart city is, right? It can cover everything from the surveillance camera dimension for public security purposes, which is what has, rightfully so, received a lot of attention, to more mundane things like having a sensor on a trash can that alerts the city that the trash needs to be picked up. That's a huge area of activity. And also one in which I think the drivers are really there's some common economic aspirations that are leading people to try to use those systems, and I think there's a big opportunity there for the U.S. and its allies to offer some kind of sustainable alternative, something that's it's environmentally friendly, socially responsible, and actually delivers the benefits that it promises too. I came across a lot of examples of some of the safe city projects that Chinese companies offer, exaggerating the benefits, and often the performance is very difficult to figure out. You mentioned subsea cables, which I think is a fascinating and critical area that I think we often take for granted. The vast majority of the world's international data goes through subsea cables. Until about a decade ago, China was basically dependent on foreign companies for those systems. It then very strategically created a foreign partnership, a joint venture with a UK headquartered company, did a series of increasingly sophisticated projects over the following decade, laid enough cable to basically encircle the world. And then that joint venture was fully purchased by a Chinese company, Hengtong Group. So they now have the world's fourth provider of those systems. And then finally, the last area that I cover is satellite communications, which I mentioned a little bit of. There's both geostationary satellites, which are sort of the older way of providing communications, and a new coming wave of low Earth orbit satellites. An example of that is Starlink, the SpaceX effort that it already has a significant and growing constellation. So literally everything from the ocean floor to outer space that we're talking about here. It's a lot to cover. And I really, I relied on a lot of experts who are deep in each of those areas as I was trying to learn.
Okay, we've got a lot of viewer questions. Before I get to those, I want to ask one final question, and it's just quoting something that you write in your book. I always find you to be very quotable. You're just a really good writer. So here's this quote. As more of daily life depends on digital infrastructure and more physical objects are connected, it is not merely different versions of the internet that are emerging, but different worlds. What are those different worlds?
Thanks. Well, so let's think about this in terms of the safe city example that we were just talking about. Imagine that you go with one provider for that set of solutions that is more focused on ensuring that the technology is leading to environmentally sustainable outcomes. So, low energy use, that there are safeguards on the usage of some of the capabilities in those systems around privacy and access to data, that the systems actually do what they're supposed to and improve everything from making sure traffic flows to lowering crime. That's one version of a city that you could live in that's sort of more sustainable. It's still protecting civil liberties, and it's thriving, right? There's opportunity there. And then the reverse of that is this kind of Wild West scenario where there are no safeguards on the equipment that's being provided. And then so you see, in that case, depending on who's using it, really wide range of impacts, everything from unintentional harm to intentional harm. You see, a world that is really struggling to deal with climate change issues. And then you see ultimately, not the benefits that are being promised, not the jobs, the economic activity that's supposed to be promoted by those. So those are two very different cities that you could imagine yourself living in. And it really, to me, has a strong connection with who's providing the systems and who's using them.
I think grasping those different visions is something that your book really helps, I think, readers understand, and is something that is a lot. That's some of the work that we need to do, in society, is helping people understand these different trajectories, because that's why it really matters. I'm going to go into viewer questions now. What is the influence of the Chinese government on policies and institutions concerning data governance? It sounds like we're also talking about maybe standards setting here.
So, one area in which I see this happening is around data localization requirements. I think, the model in which governments are moving toward data localization definitely favors China's approach here. I mean, it basically means that you're going to end up building more infrastructure locally. And so Chinese companies with, really big state lenders behind them are well positioned to do that hard infrastructure building. It makes their overall package more attractive, even if the services that are coming with that infrastructure aren't as sophisticated as some alternatives. And so, and we also, we see that playing out in some cases with literally gifts, like grant money and gifts. Serbia being gifted essentially a data center, 2 data centers. This is something that we've studied with the Reconnecting Asia project and also our Europe program. And then, so it starts with a smaller data center being given as a gift, and then a larger one being announced, and then a joint set of activities around developing artificial intelligence. And so you see a progression there in this set of activities. So I think it's, it's important to watch, but also important to think about incentives and how do you compete when those are some of the other offers at the table.
Are there concerns with the Chinese government or Chinese companies that are private companies or Chinese state-owned enterprises building data centers in other countries? Are there concerns that there might be backdoors built into it, that the company might be able to provide information to the Chinese government upon request, even though it's in another country? So
let me give 2 examples just based on investigative reporting that others have done. The first example is the African Union headquarters, where reportedly for 5 years, data was going from their servers to Beijing every night. The officials at the AU were not aware of that initially, and Huawei was the main technology provider for those systems. In Papua New Guinea, when Papua New Guinea went to the Australian government and asked for its help to try to fix a data center that wasn't working, that had been financed by China Exim Bank and provided by Huawei. There was a study that was done, an assessment that was done that essentially concluded that this data center had such poor security design that it might have been intentional. And so those are 2 examples that come to mind. And so again, I don't think it's hypothetical. And really, what's unfortunate, in both of those cases, is the these are partners or countries that thought they were being organizations that thought they were being partners that are becoming targets.
The next question we have here is, what are the best Western offerings, or I suppose maybe offerings from democratic countries, if one wants to include South Korea, to compete with Huawei in Glasgow, Montana, or Glasgow, Scotland?
So the systems in Glasgow, Montana are being replaced, and I need to see who they're going with. But the list of alternatives, is Ericsson, Nokia, and Samsung. But then there's this emerging group of companies that people won't be as familiar with, but I'm very interested in, and I think has a lot of potential in the future. And these are companies that are on the forefront of providing open RAN systems. And so they're smaller companies like Mavenir. There's Parallel Wireless, which is a company based in New England that has provided Open RAN systems all the way from 2G to 5G, and in many cases has gone head to head with Chinese suppliers in foreign markets, and in some cases won. So I think there's this new ecosystem of smaller companies, and so we might end up seeing more diversity among suppliers in the future.
What's an Open RAN system for us lay people?
Yeah, thanks. So this is essentially a way of building networks that allows you to not go with a single supplier for all your components, but to mix and match components. And so that gives you more choice. Some argue that it also ultimately saves you money. One of the challenges, though, is that as you're mixing and matching components, in some cases it can require a little bit more technical capacity to make sure all of those different components are working as intended. And so that's why there's a lot of trials and demos going on right now to try to really refine that process. But the idea is to open the door here so more companies can compete in that space and make more options available to consumers.
We have a question here about some initiatives to push back against, or to compete, we should say, with what China is doing. How realistic are, for example, the B3W, 3Cs initiative, Blue Dot Network, and 5G Clean Network able to compete with the digital BRI and the BRI generally? And if you could maybe explain what a few of those initiatives are.
Sure. So I think the first one you mentioned is B3W, which is the Build Back Better World Partnership, which was announced by the G7 in June. And so it has 4 pillars. One of those 4 pillars is digital. And so there should be a set of activities happening in which G7 countries, the world's advanced wealthy democracies, are providing more digital infrastructure and trying to use their lending, their aid in a way that, and other assistance in a way that gets the private sector more involved in some of these riskier markets. The Clean Network was, I think it's still to be determined in what form that continues. And I think the Clean Network it had some success in persuading particular countries in Western Europe to put up more rigorous security standards for how they were making choices about who to include in their 5G networks.
That was an initiative announced or spearheaded by Mike Pompeo in 2020, right? If I recall correctly, the Clean Network.
Yeah, so it was a Trump administration policy, and the 5G part of it, I think, was the most active, but it did have other lines of effort that were intended to touch subsea cables, cloud computing, and a few other areas. And so, I think I mentioned earlier too, the Quad having a focus on infrastructure and also technology. I'm actually a little bit more optimistic as someone who's studied some other areas of infrastructure, that the U.S. and its partners actually have a lot to offer in this digital space. Leading cloud computing providers, the U.S., Europe, and Japan have the world's top 3 subsea cable providers. I mentioned that we're on the leading edge of providing satellite communications. So I think we have that those advantages, and now the question is, can we bring more of those alternatives or use those advantages to create more alternatives in the developing world?
Here's an interesting question. How would you incentivize private sector investment in digital infrastructure in developing countries in the near term, given uncertain regulatory environments and higher risk profiles? How do you make some of these projects more bankable?
Yeah, so there's an effort underway, part of the Blue Dot Network, which is one of the other initiatives that you mentioned, which is to basically certify projects that meet an agreed upon quality threshold. And so providing that certification, the thinking is that will de-risk some of these projects from the standpoint of private investors. If someone has already done the due diligence, essentially, and putting that stamp of approval on it, That effort's still underway. Still more to do to operationalize it, but really promising because that's something that could have a longer term impact here. In the shorter term, we see some examples of this happening already with the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. It's invested alongside the UK in a series of data centers in Africa. There's also, I think, a really promising example of trilateral cooperation among the US, Japan, and Australia to provide a subsea cable extension that goes to Palau from a larger connection that is private sector invested. So in that case with the subsea cable to Palau, I think it's about trying to build off of efforts, places where the private sector is already active, and trying to provide small amounts of financing, technical assistance, and other forms of support to make the calculus there a little bit more attractive.
Mm-hmm. There's several questions. I'll kind of combine them because they're on a theme, and that is it really realistic to think that Western private companies can actually compete with Chinese companies when the full force of the Chinese state and the Chinese government's budget is behind some of these countries? I mean, is that really possible? Is that really realistic?
I think it is. I think when you have a better product to offer, I think, and when you sell it in a way that is appealing to the aspirations of your intended customer and not just their anxieties and sort of fears about what happens if they go with someone else. I mean, it's fine to make clear what those risks are, but ultimately you have to be offering an attractive alternative. And I do think that the U.S. and its partners and allies have advantages in this area that they don't necessarily have across the board in all other activities. But I do think that they do have several strengths here. The state financing is something that the U.S. government does not have for foreign projects on China's scale, and so that is a real challenge. But it has other things to offer. It has really competitive companies. It has technical assistance, and so I think that part of the challenge here is bringing together an attractive package and using some of the USG tools to provide, in smaller incentives. But I think we have the fundamentals. So I would be worried. I think people look at the 5G competition and say, where was the U.S. alternative? That's not the case in many of these other areas.
It's so interesting for me to see how quickly our debate and our national discussion on this has changed. I think it was, was it early 2018 when there was someone on the National Security Council named Robert Spalding, and he had come up with this idea for basically a public-private partnership of some kind for the U.S. government to help private companies in the U.S. or elsewhere construct, our own 5G network in order to prevent, Chinese companies from being the ones to build it. And he was actually essentially kicked out of the National Security Council for that. It was considered to be such a radical proposal to have the U.S. government involved in building, this kind of advanced telecommunications infrastructure. But just within the past 3 years, that kind of thinking has become totally mainstream. And in fact, it seems to be that's a lot of what we're talking about is how the democratic governments can partner with private sector, to build some of this. How has that change happened so fast?
Yeah, I think you're pointing out, that there's terms like industrial policy that might have been, scary to people politically in the past. There's now some bipartisan support for some of those policies, and it depends on what we're talking about. I think the challenge that China presents, especially economically and technologically, is behind. It's one reason that we have more bipartisan support for that set of activities. But I also think too that there's a growing awareness that we need to invest in ourselves, regardless of any other country. I mean, we need to do that for the success of the United States. And so that's why, efforts like an infrastructure package, I think, are really important for, positioning the U.S. to compete globally. And so I try to connect a few of those activities in the book. There's a lot of opportunity there to, I think, invest in promising technologies that will shift the playing field in ways that favor the U.S. and its partners. And the government has an important role to play.
We have just a couple minutes, and there's one last question that I'll ask from an audience member. Even as China is expanding its international digital surveillance and integration, the CCP appears increasingly concerned about domestic Chinese data management and security. For instance, the tech crackdown throughout this year has been related to investor disclosures, data security, and emerging sharing economy apps. Could you speak to how China sees its domestic digital space relative to its international digital Silk Road?
One of the most fascinating things for me personally, as I was doing the research for this book, was looking at the architecture of China's domestic internet. And I think you see in that some of the same motive that you see in how it's dealing with some of its companies right now, which is this overriding priority on having control. And so you see that in the fact that it funnels the vast majority of international traffic through basically 3 choke points into China, which provides an opportunity to cut off communications if that needed to be done, to censor. But there also comes with some costs too, and so I think that's the part that we sometimes don't recognize. So it does make it more difficult for China's companies to scale globally. And so, companies like Alibaba, which are giants within China and providing cloud services, are still relatively infants outside of China. They're very interested and very focused on going into developing markets. But that architecture under which they live and have to live is one of the biggest obstacles they face. So there's a to me, that overriding emphasis on control provides a really significant challenge for China's network ambitions.
Well, that's I think a very good place for us to finish our discussion. John, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today about your book, and thank you for the book itself and for the very careful research and the contribution that you have made to this important topic. And thank you to everyone in the audience for spending your hour with us today, and see you soon at the next CSIS event.